There we go. How many people are not from Minnesota in the room? Okay, because there are a lot of familiar faces. And I was thinking, we have our planning committee here. But we understand that we're also live streaming, so there are a lot of people from out of town. But good to see a lot of people from out of town here in our tropical version of Minnesota winter. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Stacy.
Yeah, thank you. Welcome. I'm afraid the people we know are here to heckle.
Well,
So we'll see if they behave or not.
They were weapon screened, so we're good.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Stacy Carlson, as Mary introduced me, and we're going to go through how we handled the Chauvin trial. A recap, this happened, the George Floyd incident happened in May of 2020. The trial itself began in March of 21, and it concluded mid to late April of 2021. So that's kind of the time frame we're talking about. They're going to give us the 10-minute warning at the end, so we'd love to hear your questions. If you can just hold them till then, we'll be happy to answer them as we go along. So thank you again for attending. So I can't say enough how much planning went into this trial. I think the number one thing for people to know if you find yourself in the situation of hosting a high-profile trial is immediately, and I mean immediately, get with your key partners so that you are all on the same page. We could not have done the trial in the way Judge Cahill wanted it to go, the way the county board wanted it to go, the way our district administrator wanted it to go, if it weren't for the collaboration of all of those partners. And that was over the span of about 10 months, and we met very, very frequently, as you can imagine. So things we learned, as I just mentioned, the relationships with your partners are absolutely key. The communication and the support to staff. Was it something you automatically think about when you think, geez, we're going to have to host a high-profile trial? Probably not, but we can tell you from firsthand experience, it's really a key factor as well. So understanding how to communicate with and support your staff is just as important. Certainly security, I'm sure most of you read a little bit about this trial or have since. It was key. And then, of course, the media. Media was everywhere. This was an international attention type of case. And so we truly did have media from all over. So just a quick timeline of the first days that we were dealing with. So as I mentioned, May 25th of 2020, the video of the George Floyd incident with the former officers goes viral. One day later, Derek Chauvin and the other 3 defendants were fired from Minneapolis. There were protests in both Minneapolis and St. Paul, and at that point, the FBI joined the investigation. So after those first initial days, there was a lot of civil unrest. The National Guard was activated, and then at that point, Derek Chauvin was arrested and moved to he was incarcerated at a facility. So we're only on day 5. Days 6 through 10, you can see there at the end of May, the Attorney General's office took over the prosecution. And on June 2nd, we already had our first employee support session. So almost instantly after the video went viral and there was civil unrest in those emerging days, we had many, many staff who were voicing their thoughts about the feeling of being a part of the criminal justice system, the incident itself, and there were just a lot of conversations happening, and it became very clear that we needed to provide some resources for our staff, not down the road, but right now. And so we contracted with some folks to facilitate some of those conversations. Our district leadership also held some listening sessions in this time as well. So by June 3rd, you can see the complaint has been amended. There were other protests, not just in Minneapolis and St. Paul, but across the country. We all can remember that. And then we had still not had yet the first appearance for Derek Chauvin. That first appearance became a moving part. At first, we thought it was going to be on a certain day. It ended up needing to be moved. So it still really didn't happen until that next week.
Can I just jump in on employee support? One thing to keep in mind is, remember, this is just at the start of COVID shutdown. So court staff, all of you, I'm sure, remember, we were all reeling from how are we going to do business now? And so we were all switching to Zoom or other remote platforms. So we had that stress that was still ongoing. And then, of course, we had to put this on top of it. So the need for employee support at that time, I think, was so critical.
Yes. By the way, there's no book for how to have a high-profile trial in a global pandemic, just in case any of you are going to look for it.
I thought it was a judge test. It's like, okay, you're going to have a high-profile trial. Okay, it's going to be police officers charged with murder. Okay, there are going to be multiple defendants. Okay, you're going to be in a pandemic, so you have to have everybody 6 feet apart. Okay, it's going to have plexiglass everywhere. Okay. So I thought it was somebody who was punking me with this stuff, that we were going to have a test. But no, there were so many things that had to be planned. I hope that none of you ever have a whole high-profile trial that has all those elements, a pandemic and everything else. But it does, I think the one thing it did teach us was lots and lots of planning.
For sure. So just a quick overview. So again, this event happened in May of 2020. Our trial started the first week of March of 2021. So in those 10 months, you can see the different things that happened. Early on with that civil unrest, we did have a few short closures of some courthouses. Judge Cahill made a live streaming decision. There were many, many hundreds, I would say, facilities and security decisions made during that time. We'll talk shortly here about the remodeling of the courtroom. The media, as we all know, was omnipresent. There were decisions made about how to summon jurors and what that process was going to look like. There were some pretrial hearings. Some were on Zoom. One was in person. I'll talk a little bit about that because we definitely learned some lessons from that. Moving our operations, we'll talk about that as well. I'll talk about that later. The secure perimeter of our government center, so the building that we held this in is called the Hennepin County Government Center. It's a shared building. We don't own it. We're renters, if you will, tenants. The Hennepin County owns that building. So that's, again, where those decisions with your partners and those positive relationships long before you needed them are just absolutely critical, because we couldn't call all the shots related to the building. We had to have support. Then we had jury selection. There was a short break, a day or two, and then the trial began. So our immediate needs was really, first of all, dealing with the first appearance. On top, layered, of course, on everything every day from this point forward, was the safety of everybody, and then the security of our facilities. And so the first appearance actually was held in the county jail, which is sort of kitty corner from our government center. And that was a little bit of our first taste of all of the moving parts. That went fairly seamlessly, but it really set the stage for what was to come. So here's some logistics that really played a part in how this trial played out. So as I mentioned, the Hennepin County Government Center, and we have a picture a little bit later here, it's a county-owned building with 2 towers. So if you think of 2 towers with 24 floors each, and sort of some bridges in the middle to get across, and then open air, if you will, between the other floors, that's the building we ultimately ended up having the trial in. One of the towers is primarily court functions, and then the other is county operations. Weapons screening is present on the skyway level, but it's not at the immediate point of entry, meaning you can come in this building at the street level or the skyway level carrying whatever you can carry. It's not until you enter one of the towers that there's actually weapons screening. So there were certainly concerns about events that may or may not happen in those unscreened areas, if you will. That was a big concern. The trial courtroom ended up being on a high floor. It was on the 18th floor. And as Judge Cahill mentioned, there had to be social distancing requirements. At that time, we were still in the 6 feet CDC guideline. And as you can imagine, in a courtroom, once you put in 6 feet and some plexiglass, there's not a lot of room for seating. Ultimately, we only had, as we mentioned from the outset, 10 months. And so we knew with COVID and the seating issues and the space, it was really going to be difficult to hold this trial. And so we were trying to avoid construction, because we all know construction doesn't happen quickly. And so ultimately, we ended up taking this courtroom that was a pretty good sized courtroom. We took out the jury box and the seats, and then we also took out the gallery seating. And so in their places, in the gallery seating, if you want to call it that, were just a small number of loose chairs. And then the jury seats were loose chairs, and then we bought little, if you think about like a school desk kind of on rollers, those were for the jurors, and those were just, because there was no box, those were just on one side of the courtroom, and then no one else could go on that side of the courtroom. So if you look at this room right now, if this side was where the jurors are, this is the only space we have for all of court operations. And so that's kind of how the courtroom was set up. We have a diagram to show that as well.
And that did impact the social distancing. Even though we took one side of the courtroom for the jury, we could only fit with the 6 feet 14 chairs. I wanted to have 16 jurors so that I had 4 alternates. But because of the spacing, there was just no way to do it. So we had to go into trial knowing how long it was going to be, and with only 2 alternates with COVID. And we had a juror throw up the first day. So I was like, not a good start. But we made it through.
So we tested many different configurations in this courtroom for the counsel tables. As Judge Cahill mentioned at the outset, there were, originally, there were going to be 4 defendants. In the end, it was just 1 defendant for this trial, but there were a number of counsel tables needed. I think we ended at 5, was that right?
Yeah, I think so.
So 5 counsel tables with chairs in half of a space takes up most of that. The court reporter, because of social distancing, they could not be up on the bench because there wasn't 6 feet between their spot and the witness spot. So we bought a makeshift, if you will, workstation for her to be on the floor in front of the bench so that she could be 6 feet away from the witness and vice versa. And then ultimately, as we said, this was a lot of trial and error, a lot of trips up to the courtroom, moving furniture around, fun times. So the picture on the left is the government center. As I mentioned, kind of if you look at the 2 brown areas, those are the 2 different towers, and then in the middle, some of those floors have bridges so that you can walk across, but most of them don't. This is a picture up top of the jury seats and the jury desks. The chairs are not attached to the desks. They're both loose and independent. And then the bottom diagram here is what we ultimately ended up with. So you can see up here is the bench. These are all of the jury seats. This was the court reporter station, the podium, and then the counsel tables, except that we ultimately added 1 more, I believe. Maybe we didn't. Maybe there were 4. And then here, not depicted, there were those very few seats for seating of observers. And then this door back here would normally go to the jury deliberation room. That space running behind the door here, over here, is where Court TV lived and breathed for many, many weeks. So all of their operations were in the back there. So just a couple more pictures. You can see the plexiglass that Judge Cahill mentioned. So you can see the plexi on top of the podium, on top of the court reporter station, and then running across the bench. Just some pictures of the attorneys speaking from behind the plexi. And then a quick picture of one angle of the government center. And the government center was completely fenced off. There was one way in, one way out. It was a layered credentialing system, which I'll talk about in a minute. So anybody that was going in that building had to be a part of the trial, or they had no purpose to get in there. And trust me, there were a lot of credentialing, a lot of daily lists, and a lot of security checks to make sure that nobody got in or out that wasn't supposed to. So we talked about our trial planning team. We got on this pretty early as we came to kind of understand the assignment pretty early on. And so we took 1 or 2 people at most from the critical areas and put them on our trial team. And we met at different times. We met once a week, maybe once every other week, a lot of meetings, and had the right people in the room. One thing I will mention is nobody came to this meeting just to get the info. If they did not have an absolute need to know, they were not there. And so sometimes that meant hard feelings from senior managers or other people that, maybe their direct report was at this meeting because they needed to be, because they did the work that was needed, but the manager wasn't in the know. And so again, that was for confidentiality purposes, and everything in these meetings that was shared and discussed was considered confidential. So in terms of communication, one thing we stole, no pun, we stole a page from another district that had I think it was Mary's district. When Mary's district had the Prince case, they put up a web page for all of the documents that were going to be coming out or filed or whatever the media might want to see, so that they didn't have to answer 100 phone calls every hour about trying to get those documents. And so we stole that idea and put up a public web page for all of the documents that were going to be filed in here, so that the media could go there, they could look at orders, they could look at whatever was filed. As the trial actually started, we also, our media folks, communications people, also would put notes on there as far as when the jury was seated, and then when they started deliberating and when they ended deliberations for the day. So again, we weren't answering phone calls all day long. Is the jury still out? Are they done deliberating for the day? Those kinds of things. So we highly recommend stealing from Carver County, and if you find yourself doing this, having a dedicated web page.
Way to go, Mary. We did have 14,000 phone calls during the trial, but that's another story.
Yeah.
That was more people letting us know that we were entitled to their opinion about things. So.
We have what we call a call center or contact center. That's kind of an information line, if you will, where people can call with general questions. So we had a phone tree number where it said, if you're calling about the Derek Chauvin case, press 3, and then no one was going to answer it. It all went to voicemail. And then we had some of our managers of that area check the messages a couple times a day for threats. There were a lot of them. In addition to people telling Judge Cahill how he should do his job, there were threats against, Judge Cahill, the staff, the building, the government, you name it. Lots of people who had investigative tips. Lots of comments about what was happening. People were really fascinated with the mask you wore. They wanted to know where you bought it.
My Hannibal Lecter mask, as people called it. So
again, this was it seemed like primetime viewing because everybody was calling and thought we wanted their opinion. So we also highly recommend doing that, as having that voicemail so that you can just route people right away to, if they want to leave their thoughts.
And for those of you in administration, thank you for screening your judges from this kind of stuff. I was able to do the trial. They didn't tell me about the threats. It was just, you find out some stuff kind of through back channels, but not a lot of threats, not a lot of the response. And for God's sakes, tell your judges not to go to social media. It's just a cesspool. And so the fact that they kind of filtered all that was very welcome to me, because it didn't distract me then.
So in terms of pre-trial staff support, we had a lot of staff who were afraid to come downtown. There was a lot of civil unrest initially. As we got closer to the trial, when the fencing went up, it looked fairly intimidating. People did not want to come to work. A lot of them were very afraid for their own safety. Again, ever since the incident, there were folks unsure if they wanted to continue to work for the criminal justice system. And then just, again, stress and some trauma, even just from COVID, and then layering this on top of that. So there was a lot of conversations with staff and resources that were offered. And there were some hard conversations. Our district leadership had listening sessions, and there were a lot of hard conversations. I think one of the main points from a number of our staff were, why weren't we putting a statement out condemning the actions of the officers? And so the balance and the tightrope act there was maintaining the neutrality of the court and not commenting, and understanding this is really affecting our staff. And so those were hard conversations. There was a lot of criticism, understandably, and people's feelings were raw, they were real, and they were all valid. So that was really tough. The media. You want to talk about the media a little bit?
Well, the media needed access to the court process, obviously. This was, there were protests around the world. There was a high level of interest. And we want to have a good relationship. We always want to have a good relationship with the media. But at the same time, they're not our friends, but they're not our enemies. And to be honest, a little criticism of the media, they are never satisfied with what you give them. I mean, in Minnesota, we generally do not allow trials to be televised. And so my decision to live stream, which to be honest, for people in the family here, came very early in my mind, is like, there is no way we can do a public trial with 6 spectator seats and nothing else. So it was, if nothing else, it had to be public by live streaming. And so we had to work with them, and we had a really good relationship with Court TV. They came in, and I think partially because they're very professional, but they also knew that this was a test for Minnesota. The media in Minnesota has been pushing to televise trials, and so they wanted it to go well. And so they were very accommodating on what I was willing to do. And so it was actually very good, and we provided space for the rest of the media in a building across the street. We had, 50-some desks, and they were projected the raw live stream. Because what you saw on Court TV obviously was produced, that they went to various shots. They were able to see the 3 cameras, and then the 4th one, which was the evidence feed from the evidence card. So all the videos and all that, we weren't taking pictures of the video from a monitor. It was an actual feed so that it was good quality. And so they were able to see all 4 quadrants at once, and not just what was being broadcast to the general public. And I think we had a great deal of appreciation about that. We didn't want this to be a lot of, trying to figure out how the media gets access, but at the same time bugging us or trying to get around restrictions. And I think by giving them ground rules, for example, we were on the 18th floor, which is a fairly small floor. There were 3 courtrooms. One was converted to a defense workroom, one was the jury lounge, and one was the main courtroom. And we said, this is a secure floor. We put mirrored, that's probably in here somewhere, kind of a mirrored film on the windows that face the atrium, so people couldn't be on the other side taking pictures. And we said, you cannot interview people on the 18th floor. Now, despite live streaming, despite providing them with space and the raw footage over in the media center, that's when I heard some reporter say, what is this, North Korea? It's like, really? I'm giving you more access than ever before. But they were concerned that they could not interview people coming out of the courtroom on the 18th floor. We said, you can interview them somewhere else, but and ask them, can I meet you down on the Skyway level and do an interview there? But I didn't have to deal with the media too much, because as you can see, I get a little jumpy with them. Not really. But Chief Judge Barnett actually was kind of the go-between between me and the media. The media had a coalition. A lot of the mainstream media outlets, and they had a lawyer, a local lawyer, who did a lot of their litigation for them, motions for the access. For example, when I decided the other 3 would not be tried with live stream, they filed briefs trying to get me to change my mind. And so it was good to have, so if you can have a media coalition kind of come together and be represented by one lawyer, it also makes it easy for who are the 2 in the courtroom. I don't have to make that decision. We turned that over to the media coalition. And you say, you rotate, you figure it out, one electronic, one print media. I'm not going to get involved in that. I'm not going to get accused of picking favorites. Media coalition, you figure it out. And it worked actually very well. And they provided a wide variety of media outlets that actually got to be in the courtroom. Even Der Spiegel from Germany was one of the rotating reporters. So, and Chief Judge Barnett basically did that, and the communications team met with that group. And I think we had Spencer at the time, one of our media people, over in the media center all the time and available. so that if they had problems or they had questions, they could go to him and while things were going on. And that way, I could focus on the trial. Chief Judge Barnett could focus on dealing with the media on this level. So.
Whoops. Uh-oh. One thing I'll just mention, and we have a picture of the workroom, is Judge Cahill allocated those very few seats that were in the gallery so that each side got a certain amount, I think three maybe.
Yeah.
And then as he mentioned, the media got 2 seats in the courtroom every day that they had to rotate amongst themselves. And so all the other media for this trial anyway, because the building was closed, all the other media either didn't come downtown or they were in the media workroom. And so we'll show you a picture of that in just a little bit here. So some other things we did as far as media relations during the trial, our communications folks prepared a media guide in advance. Again, this was to ward off call after call after call every single day from media folks. So this was kind of the 101 of what's going to happen with this trial and kind of a frequently asked questions. What can you do? What can't you do? Well, what if this, what if that? And so that went a long way to warding off a lot of daily questions as well. As we mentioned, we hosted a media workroom. The county had recently purchased a building, conveniently enough, right across the street from the courthouse. And it had a big auditorium in it. And so we made that a media workroom. And so we had some tables there. It had outlets for them to come, and they could just sit in there. Again, because they couldn't get into the courtroom, they couldn't get into the government center unless they were on that daily list for those 2 spots. And so they could work in this workroom. If you think of it, it was like, for lack of a better term, like a viewing room, a viewing party. It had a giant screen that, as Judge Cahill mentioned, was showing the feed from the live courtroom. So they missed nothing, but they were free to transmit from that room, type, take their notes, talk, whatever. I will say we didn't do that in the following high-profile trial, mainly, 2 reasons. One, it was very staff-intensive. We had 2 people, both of our communications people were there every single day, all day, to liaison with the media. But also the next trial we had, the building was open. And so we just didn't feel like we really had the same obligation to provide that space. And then I think we already covered this. Oh, one of the things which is always a big issue, at least in our building, is the media satellite trucks. Where can we park? We very quickly realized we're not getting in the business of parking. So our plaza outside the government center has 4 spots every single day. That's it. Otherwise, we just referred people, work through the city of Minneapolis if you want a designated spot. Otherwise, find a meter, what have you, that kind of thing.
And don't have the temptation for your judge to start issuing orders, closing streets and designating parking spaces for people. Just stay out of it. If they want to try and negotiate with your city that you're in to have parking spots, that's on them. Let them talk to the city, because it's the city's concern on public safety and parking. So just avoid the temptation for your judge to order everything. We are closing down a 1-mile perimeter. No, just leave it to them.
So a couple pictures here. I'll start on the right here. This was just the seating chart. So the little, I don't even know what color those are, rectangles, those were tables. They each had, I think, 1 or 2 chairs. And then the list next to it was which outlet. We didn't really care who showed up. We just knew you had to be with the outlet on the list for that day. So they could swap out reporters if something changed. And then there were some rules there. But even in the media workroom, if you weren't registered for that workroom, you couldn't just walk in there. You had to be registered. The middle picture is just from the back. You can see the screen up there. It's got the 4-quadrant view that Judge Cahill referenced before. And then those media members are just working at their tables. And then this far left picture is just an outside look of the building. And so this is the building here. This room was on the main level. And the county, as a prevention, boarded up. It was all glass on the bottom here. And so they boarded that up in preparation for the trial. And one day it was super, super windy. And some of the plywood blew down, which you can see there. And rumors instantly started that there was some humongous riot over there. when in reality it was just really windy, and the plywood came off. And so the rumor control, I mean, it wasn't necessarily ours to control, but it was just, it was out of control, really.
And the media center was not limited to mainstream media. We actually had a blog, the Powerline blog, had a desk, and they were right next to AP. So if you registered, we didn't do sifting, like are you mainstream media or not. We just, if you registered and we could accommodate the space, there you go.
And that was one of the nice things about, as Judge Cahill mentioned earlier, having the media coalition work amongst themselves, because we might think, well, the AP is media, but I might work in my basement by myself and have a blog, and I view myself as the media, and I want a seat there too. So we didn't have to weigh in on, well, are you a real media outlet or not? It was all up to the media coalition to make those decisions and have some fair system for having seating and that kind of thing. So segueing to security. So in our district, the Hennepin County Sheriff's Office provides our day-to-day court services security. For this trial, the Hennepin County commissioners, again, we don't have the say in this building because we don't own it. They had concerns about safety for the building, the people that were going to have to come into it for this trial, and they decided to put barricades and fencing all around the building. At the end of the day, as I mentioned, there was one way in and one way out on the street level, and that was staffed by many security officers, the National Guard, and pretty much everybody else who was in law enforcement at the time. And so we sent that information out to our jurors, which, as you can imagine, we had concerns about that as well, as far as what that looks like. How are they going to get into the building? It's a big, on a good day, that building is overwhelming for a lot of people to try to navigate. So we used a layered credentialing system. So what I mean by that is just to get in that building, you had to have a specific credential. Your name had to be on a daily access list that we had to provide every day to the security. And then a separate credential was needed to get to the 18th floor. So you may have had some business, if you were one of the court staff who had to come in, you may have been doing something in the building, but you didn't have any need to go up to the 18th floor. You wouldn't have had that credential. So this was really winnowed down to who had to be in the building, period, and then who had to be on the 18th floor. One thing we did of huge note is, because the building was going to be closed, we had to move all of our other government center operations to a different building. Now that, I will say, was one of the trickiest things we had to do. Luckily, we did have some experience from COVID and having to shut down and do things remotely on a dime, but we moved all of the other operations from that building to one of our other buildings for those 6 weeks. So literally no one was coming into that building unless they were there to support this trial. And so just to give you an idea, I think on the daily list that we would send, we had about a total of maybe 30 people in the whole building. And if you went there right now, it's thousands of court users and hundreds of staff. And so it really was just a very small group of people. The sheriff's office had a SharePoint site for this trial that they used, we had a SharePoint site that we wanted to make sure we could have an accounting for all of our staff, regardless of what building they were working in. So we had supervisors register every single day who was going to be in which buildings, so that if there was civil unrest or there had to be closures, we would have that accountability to make sure that we know where all our people are. Are we missing anybody? Did everybody get out? That kind of thing. The sheriff's office used an online app where we would send the daily access list to them the day before, and it would populate for all their deputies, and then they could see if you were on the list or not. And then Operation Safety Net was the global law enforcement operation for the Twin Cities Metro, and they, of course, met separately as far as their response. This is just a picture. Our downtown police precinct is right about here. And so this was just completely barricaded with National Guard for a little bit before the trial. I think all of the barricades went up about 1 week before the trial started. And they didn't come down the day after. They stayed up for a little while.
And for reference, the tower there is City Hall, which is across from the Government Center. That gives you an idea of
This one right
locations.
here. So this is an image of one of the people. So we are building, no one would build our building the way it is today. It's built
32 entrances. Isn't that fun for security?
It was built in 1978, and in addition to the 32 entrances, a street runs under it, and it has an underground parking ramp. And so we did utilize the underground parking ramp for the few key staff who had to come into the building, and then also for the case parties. So the case parties were never walking into the building from the outside. They had to enter through this parking ramp. And at the parking ramp was a sliding gate with National Guard and Hennepin County Sheriff's Office deputies. So as you pulled up there, you had to have your credential. You obviously had to have the right one in order to get down there. And so these next couple pictures are just people, again, that were coming to the parking ramp. And then that's another picture of it. What you can't see is across the street from there on the corner is where a lot of activists would stand. And every time someone would come in, they were yelling things. Not like, hey, you guys are doing a great job. That's I never heard that one. But so every time you roll down your window, aside from the imagery of this, you were reminded verbally of, it's just a really heavy time here. So a lot going on there. And then again, just one more picture of this. One thing we did, as you can see, the media was everywhere. There was a lot of photography out here. We didn't let Judge Cahill use his own car for obvious reasons, much to his chagrin. So as you can see, I mean, his license plate would have been very visible. So.
And my car is fairly unique. I drive a light blue Honda Fit. So it's not the black Malibu that you see everywhere that would blend in. So I did drive it during jury selection, but then the chief judge made me get the rental. So, but they paid for it, so it's fine with me.
So technology. Couple things happened here. So our regular courtrooms, they're already, of course, much like yours, I'm sure, equipped with sound system, and then we use CourtSmart for our digital court reporting system. So we already had that in the courtroom that we used on the 18th floor. What we did add, though, for this trial were sidebar headsets so that Judge Cahill didn't have to have the parties come up and then turn on the white noise machine and do all that. So everybody had the headset that was going to have to be involved in the sidebars. And then that, eliminated anybody hearing what they were talking about. And then we installed what we call evidence presentation technology. So luckily, a little stroke of luck, prior to months and years before this trial actually ever was on the radar, we were working with our partners to install digital evidence presentation technology in many of our courtrooms. And as it had happened, the courtroom next to this one, we had sort of installed it. We didn't permanently install it. We kind of rigged everything up right before COVID hit to see if all of our, as a proof of concept really, and Jason, I know he's just grimacing at my lack of technical terms here. But we had rigged it up just as a proof of concept, and then just as COVID hit, we were going to have a lot of open houses with our partners to see if they liked it and all of these things. And so COVID happened, this happened, and so what we ended up doing was transferring all of that technology from the courtroom next door and permanently installing it. And so that is what allowed us to have evidence displays, and otherwise we don't have any evidence displays in our courtrooms right now. You huddle around one laptop or whatever. And so that was some luck that was on our side from some completely unrelated work that we had already been headed toward. And so we did that.
There was a weird stroke of luck with that as well, in that I had a first-degree murder trial with 2 defendants go forward in January of 2021, so 2 months before the Chauvin case. So it was good because all the technology was in place and we were able to shake the bugs out. I mean, shake the bugs out using a first-degree murder trial, it sounds a little odd, but it had a lot of video, kind of the same thing, everything we wanted to test out, including the telestrator system. that the witness could use. So it was, and we did find a few bugs and we did shake a few things out, and so it was a nice test. So if you can do all this and then do a test trial, take one of your trials that might be video intensive, and every criminal trial now is video intensive because there's body worn cam, there's surveillance everywhere. So just about every criminal trial has video. Test out your system if you're going to equip it so that you can shake bugs out, because there will be bugs.
So then we, throughout, obviously we did a lot of testing prior to this, the trial itself, but then also right up until the very morning of the Chauvin trial, we had technicians on site. And just in case there were glitches.
Does this be a good time to talk about the plexiglass and the challenges, or is that later?
It's a little bit later.
Okay.
Yeah, a little bit later.
I hate plexiglass, that's fine.
And then, as we already mentioned, Court TV used their technology to accommodate the live streaming. And then one thing that many of the media outlets did, they didn't want the stream and the production from Court TV to show on their network or their channel, if you will. And so there's some technology that a few of us got way more information about than we ever wanted to know in our entire lives, about how they could plug into something called the Lumen box, and then anybody could show the feed, and it would just look like it was coming right from their network or their channel. And so that's how, because many people were running this feed besides Court TV, and they didn't want what Court TV was, branding it with. So do you want to talk about live streaming a little bit? I think you covered some of these.
Yeah, I've pretty much said why, and I knew that early on once the chief judge came to my doorway and said, "You get this case." Thank you, Judge Barnett. A little aside there, I give him grief for giving me this case, but it made sense. This is one of the actual real world concerns. This is going to be stressful for any judge. Absolutely. You don't want to give it to somebody who has to stand for an election again. I was running for election, but filings were closed and I was unopposed. But if you have an election system in your jurisdiction, I think it's cruel to make a judge stand for election after doing one of these trials. And looking at the number of people who are on our criminal felony team, a lot of them are still going to be standing for election. I am not. I'm 2 years out and I'm done. So I think that actually came into the live streaming decisions. Like, somebody's got to do this. Somebody's got to live stream it possibly because of COVID and everything else. We picked Court TV. They were in early on to give us some advice. When we were still at the Family Justice Center, we were thinking of doing the trial there. We did the motion hearing there. The security was awful. It didn't work. 2 of the lawyers got attacked. So we decided very quickly that's not going to work for trial, even though it had our biggest courtroom. We said that's not going to work. But Court TV was even there during that time talking about what could be done. There's so many logistics that court administration has to get good at to set up. I, of course, just said we're going to live stream, you guys figure it out. Although there is an extensive order on live streaming on what the media producer could do and how there was no copyright to it and a variety of other things that I dealt with our state court administration, legal division. They were on speed dial for me on this trial. And they looked at the order that I was preparing with the idea of, are we covering all the intellectual property issues, not just where you can put your cameras and things like that. We figured out where the camera angles could be, which is very important because this was an anonymous jury. Not because, it was more so that nobody tampered with them, nobody called them. We got 14,000 calls telling me what I was doing wrong. We didn't want the jurors getting 14,000 calls telling them what they were doing wrong. So it was going to be an anonymous jury, at least, and I told the jury during selection that we were going to eventually have to release their names, but probably not for 6 months or so after the trial, which is exactly what we did. But with the anonymous jury, we also had to be very careful on camera angles to make sure that they were never shown. So we actually had a tape on the floor in front of the jury box that we said, when you come in, We're going to bring you in the back hallway and through this door, the one that was right by the door that you saw went into the jury room where the court TV people were. And don't walk in front of the line. If you stay behind that line as you're walking to your seat, they will not be able to see you. We've adjusted the camera angles. But then we also had to adjust because of all the plexiglass, because the plexiglass could reflect the jurors. And I'll show you how the more educated you get, the more you lose your common sense. First juror on the stand. I get an email. I'm on the bench, and an email pops up from one of our retired judges saying, we can see the juror in the reflection of the lawyers, because the lawyers were at the lectern, witnesses were in front of them, the camera was on my bench pointing this way. We can see. We can't make out much, but we can see the reflection. And I go, all right, get the carpenters in here. We gotta cut it down or something. So court TV came in and went, oh, yeah, that works too. But it did indicate the level that when you have all this plexiglass, aside from the social distancing, the plexiglass, you had reflective angles everywhere. And we had to make sure that no matter what the camera position was, that it did not reflect. I had plexiglass right in front of me. And we realized that that was reflecting, Derek Chauvin was right there, right in front of me. And he was taking notes. And we realized you probably couldn't read it, but my plexiglass was reflecting his notes. So if you watch the trial again, which I would not recommend, you'll see that midway through we put up a little barrier so that when the reflection, you couldn't see his notes. But that's the kind of level of, you have to sit and actually have to test and go through mock witness coming on the witness stand, judge on the bench, what are the angles, so if you ever have to do this in a pandemic again and you have plexiglass, that was probably one of the biggest challenges of live streaming. The rest, they're used to doing. It's just making sure all these angles were such that we didn't show things. In fact, I think you've got a slide with Dana.
I do, yeah. Yep. Let's see if I can just show it real quick here. So this, you can see a face right here above the white bar. We got a lot of call, you're showing the jurors, you're showing the jurors. That's actually our court reporter. And I mentioned we had to put her on the floor in a workstation because there wasn't 6 feet. And so that's an example of what Judge Cahill is talking about, is the reflection. That was, we didn't want her face either, but it was less than that it wasn't a juror. But yeah, if you think people don't notice stuff, trust me. This is like opening your living room and just having a live feed and just waiting for people to call. One thing I will mention too is the first day we had calls come in. One of the attorneys was a woman and she was wearing a skirt. Imagine the calls we got on that. So by the next day, we had purchased table skirts just like that. So nobody could see underneath the table. So it just really ran the gamut from soup to nuts as far as what people were calling in on.
Emphasis on nuts.
Yeah. So talking again about some of our challenges in supporting our staff, our district administrator made the decision that our staff could watch or listen to the trial as long as they weren't doing it in front of, when the public were at our counters or anywhere where there were public. And that they were still doing their work. So if they wanted to have the live stream up but minimized and so they could just have the audio, that was accepted. We also had many webinars, is what that should say, and self-paced learning around stress management. Again, pandemic and this event just compiled on top of each other. A lot of use of our EAP system. We had different groups and spaces for staff to discuss how this was impacting them. And a lot of work around stress inoculation. I mentioned earlier, we moved all of our government center. We have 6 buildings total. 2 are out in the suburbs, but the other 4 are right down in the downtown area within just a few blocks of each other. So we moved all of the other government center operations to the Family Justice Center. And there were pluses and minuses to the building being, fenced off and closed, and similarly, there were pluses and minuses to having moved all of our operations. So just Some things were easier and some things were more difficult because we did that. Signage was a big key on that, so we would still have people showing up outside the government center at this, once they found like the one door where you could actually enter if you were allowed. Of course, they weren't allowed, but they still had court business that they were there to conduct. And so we had to have signage, we had to have extensive communication and cheat sheets for our security officers to know where do you send so-and-so when they're looking for such and such. And so even though it was March and it was it actually was a pretty mild March, all things considered, but lots of people still showing up outside and having to walk several blocks to where, we had relocated our area. So signage and communication were huge. And then believe it or not, one of the peskiest ever details was how to reroute the mail. And so I won't even get into this, but this was a full-time job for somebody for about 2 weeks trying to get this squared away. Again, one little detail out of hundreds. Ultimately, we got it figured out, but it was really difficult. So just some other images. This is on the plaza of the government center, which is just a big outdoor area. In the back there, you can see the fencing. So that's as close as anybody could get. And they could do whatever they wanted on this side of the fencing. This was just put out on, I think, Instagram. The Reverend Al Sharpton and the George Floyd family, they had many different press conferences over the course of the trial. Again, you see some of these folks show up. We had some folks show up. We had, I think, Jesse Jackson show up. I think we had Maxine Waters show up. And of course, they wanted to come in. And they're not on the list. And so they ended up, I think a different partner actually let them in, but they were not on the list to come in, but a different partner let them in and hosted them. But we had people just roll up wanting to come in for some of these press conferences. This is a little bit of humor, Minnesota humor. So one day during the trial, it was the first Wednesday of the month, and if you're in Minnesota, you know the tornado alarms go off at 1 o'clock, and they go off twice right in a row. And so this went out, again, we talked about rumor control. This was some big, national security alarm going off in the minds of some reporters, and you can see, nope, it's just the first Wednesday of the month in Minnesota. So whatever there was that could kind of be made from a little molehill into a mountain, oftentimes it was. You never think George Clooney is going to weigh in on your work, but here we were. And then Saturday Night Live, of all the heaviness of this, they actually had a skit on the trial. And then this is from our local paper. If you can't read it way in the back, it's just the Chauvin jury and then the pressure cooker. I'll talk just for a minute about our court reporter. So we assigned one primary court reporter that Judge Cahill had worked with in the past. So she was assigned. We also had a backup reporter that was on site every day, but not in the courtroom, just in case. We also had a second backup assigned, but they were not on site every day. So we did have contingencies. This was not a trial where the parties had requested daily copies, so there was no immediate transcript need. As I mentioned, we configured a special court reporter station on the floor because of social distancing. And then our CourtSmart backup audio, of course, was also running in the background, but she was obviously a stenographer taking the real-time record. And then
there was some media, by the way, who were asking about daily copy. And we said, we're live streaming this. You want daily copy? Hire a court reporter. Have them watch the live stream. So it quickly became a non-issue.
And then just to mention, we had a lot of protocols for the court reporter, also for Judge Cahill, his staff, and a few other people as they would, enter the building and making sure everyone could get in safely and get out safely. So I mentioned this is about the plexi. So as the trial went on, I think they went to deliberate around the mid-April-ish. I think they came back on the 20th of April, if I remember right. So as you can imagine, we had a lot of conversations around the verdict. I will tell you, we didn't even start talking about the verdict almost until the trial started, just because we had these thousands of other details to deal with just to get the trial going. So we didn't even worry about the verdict very much until the actual trial started, but lots of conversations around the logistics of it, staff support, what was that going to look like. In terms of logistics, one of the things, if you ever have one of these trials, we had to find a hotel for sequestering the jurors. And so that contract had to be completely confidential. There had to be, no disclosure from the hotel. And what hotels don't love is when you call them and say, hey, look, we're not sure what day we're going to get there and how many nights we want, but can you reserve a bunch of rooms for us? One thing that was lucky for us was COVID, and so they were a year into pretty much zero business at that point, and so we did luck out and had some great collaboration with the hotel. But there were some, other moving parts with that as well. We had to have technology brought to the hotel and set up. And as sort of simple as that sounds, the logistics was we couldn't use our regular movers that we use for like chamber moves or office moves because of the confidentiality piece. And so luckily one of our partners, the county, had a nondescript truck and a trustworthy person that would drive it. And so even the tiniest granular details had to be discussed as far as that. And so we had listening sessions again. What we did for, I'm not sure if it's on the next, oh yeah, it is. So what we had decided after talking with our law enforcement partners was that we would give about a 2-hour notice for the verdict to be read. So from whatever point it came in, it would be held for about 2 hours for law enforcement to stage. And so that is what happened. The verdict ended up coming in around, 1:30 or 2-ish or so, was read about 2 hours later. The minute we knew the verdict was in, we used our ad hoc emergency notification system with our staff and texted them, the building's closing, go home. We sent out emails to the same effect. A bunch of us went floor to floor to make sure all of the few staff that were in the government center and then the staff in the other buildings were sent home, and we closed those buildings in those 2 hours. So it was as much for law enforcement as it was for us to shut down our operations in a somewhat orderly manner.
We also had contingency on the verdict what time the verdict came in. We really did not want to read the verdict in the dark. So we said we kind of had our cutoffs, and I can't remember what they were, but we said if it comes in by this time, we'll read it 2 hours later. There's still light, everything else. We don't want it to be in the dark. So let's figure that out, and luckily we were able to just read it, normal course, 2 hours, and went from there. We didn't want to really have that problem because with all the National Guard and everything standing around, better in the daytime.
So then just a couple other pictures. This was after the verdict was read, just our local newspaper, excuse me, and then some national newspapers. This is just an example. This was our internal texting. Downtown courthouses are closing now. Please stop work at all locations, exit immediately. And then again, you don't really think a former president's going to normally weigh in on your work, but Barack Obama weighed in as well.
That picture right there, you can see Mr. Chauvin being let off. They had even did a mock exercise of that. So they drill, another deputy stood in his place, and because it's something they do every day, but it's like, know who's going to do it, know where it's going to happen. Are you going to put cuffs on here? Or are you going to put cuffs on there? They had to consult with me because I have certain protocols I like. So they staged it. They did a mock exercise. You can't do too much planning on even the fine details like that.
So just before we open it up for questions, we had contingency plans for the day and days after the verdict, depending on what would transpire. So we weren't going to be open. What were we going to do if this and if that? At the end of the day, there really was no civil unrest, and so we didn't close any buildings the following day. But it wasn't just, throw open the doors, business as usual. Everything was still locked down. It was very few people down there, but court ran as usual, as much as usual was during those 6 or 7 weeks. And then gradually, a couple days later, we picked a day where we were going to move everything back into the government center, and then the county would deal with the fencing, but we could open up the doors and that kind of thing. So fortunately, we didn't have to do any of that other kind of alternate location after the verdict. But it was still a slow return to normal. Again, what normal was in COVID, still in the height of COVID. So that is our presentation, and I think we have some time for questions.
Can you hear that? I'll repeat it. How did the jurors get in and out of the courtroom each day and the building itself? The sheriff's office quickly went to a plan where we had dispersed sites where the jurors would drive to and park that were under county control. And then they had several vans, and they put them in vans and brought them down and went into the underground parking. And then, of course, they went through a hallway to the freight elevator, so they were never seen by the public, except maybe they could see the vans coming in. But that was about it. But it also, kept the jurors from having to worry about their cars being seen and pictures being taken and license plates being run. And that, I think, worked very well. Made the jurors feel pretty safe. Also, do that with if you're going to keep your lawyers and your judge out of the public eye as much as possible. You say, but you live stream this, yeah, but that's all I wanted to be on TV. I didn't want them seeing me walking along the Skyway system, essentially doing the judge perp walk, for the media to get their daily dose of me waving to them. So I went in the same way. Public never saw me either. Question?
Okay. Earlier you talked about the employee support as you being the the leader and almost like the representative of the judiciary in this, and carrying that weight of making all of these decisions that impacted so many people. How did you process? What was it like when you received the call that it was going to be you? What was it like having to make the kind of decisions that you had to make? And how did you handle that and balance that with your responsibility to the judiciary, and then what you maybe had to deal with going home as far as, your families and the people who serve with you? How did you handle that or process that?
Well, this is where my PTSD comes in. This might trigger a little bit because I always choke up when I talk about this. Thanks for the question. I have a very strong support network. My wife has been hearing me give closing arguments to her and talk about law stuff for 42 years. So I have 4 kids, 3 of whom are in the metro area, very supportive. My neighbors dropped off care packages. I think they kind of got a thrill out of the fact that we got all these cops and sheriffs walking around. And, they dropped off, a lot had alcohol in it, so I was wondering what my reputation was, and yes, I did partake, but I tried not to do too much. I just had a very good, strong support network, and I had to tell myself throughout, okay, other people are taking care of the other details, and I think that's where the team concept helped me deal with this, is I could just focus on what was happening in courtroom 1856. Judge Barnett could focus on what was happening in the government center. The sheriff's office and law enforcement could take care of the rest outside. I made the mistake of one night going on social media. Ooh, bad idea. But other than that, I stayed away from the media, social media, just tried the case as straight up as I could. Good lawyers, that helped. Nevertheless, I thought I came out of it pretty well from a stress level. I think my wife said, yeah, just another trial. And so she let me say that during the trial. But afterwards, she was very much, well, here's some things. And I said, the reason I choke up is because I sent an email after the trial to all staff saying thanks, because every employee in our district was affected by this trial. Change of process, moving buildings, having to deal with the calls that were coming in, which kept me kind of in a very nice, safe space. Sent out a thank you notice, and the response I got from staff was just heartwarming, and I think I'm sitting on my couch sobbing, because I so am so proud of working in the 4th District. And just that response from everybody. And that's when I realized, maybe you were feeling a little stress. So even though if your judge is, I can handle it, I'm fine, like some of us. I was a prosecutor for years, I was a defense lawyer for years, I've done all this stuff, I've seen all this stuff. Push them to take a little bit of counseling. Luckily, one of my daughters has counseling background, and she's going to sign me up for EMDR training to get rid of a little bit of PTSD. But it's mostly a strong support network. And if you don't have that, colleagues are a great support network. If nothing else, they'll be happy to say, you're doing a good job, because they're glad it's not them. But otherwise, tried to treat it the same as everything, knowing it was not the same as everything.
Thank you. I appreciate your presentation, and I have a greater understanding and appreciation for the logistical concerns. I have a question related to employee retention. So earlier, it was mentioned that some employees were on the fence about sticking with the court system, and a lot of resources were provided in terms of D&I sessions and listening sessions. Could you talk a little bit about the value in those? Did some of those employees who were on the fence decide to stay? What was that experience? And I know those were hard discussions to have.
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's a little hard to know for sure, except for a small number who left because they clearly stated in some exit interviews, I don't want to be a part of the criminal justice system anymore. The reason it was hard to know how many left because of this is because we lost a ton due to COVID. And we, like I'm sure many of you, have gone through a tremendous turnover in our staff in the last 2 years. But yeah, many people stayed. I mean, they really did. We lost a few for sure. But part of that is just in certain areas, we have high turnover on a good day before COVID and before a trial like this. But it really boiled down to, I think, them seeing our leadership cared, offering the resources, and then not just making it a one hit for March and April of 2021, but continuing to build those resources and have that support system there long after this trial was over, and just realizing, I think it's easy, certainly been guilty of it before in different careers, but a lot of us think, well, you bring your work self to work and check everything else at the door. This, along with COVID, no one should ever doubt, an employer needs to respond and work with the whole person, not just the professional who does this or that. Everybody's whole person shows up for work every day. And I think that was a gigantic shift in some of the things we did and some of our paradigms as we moved through this.
Absolutely. Thank you.
We have a question online too. The question is, what criteria do you use to determine if a trial should be live streamed or not?
Well, the rule says we shouldn't, so I made up my own. I basically went, and you can read my order, it's a public document, that was basically, this was such a unique situation that COVID and the international attention that was being paid, that we had to do live stream. Judge Chu, in the following the Officer Potter case, also did live streaming, and we talked a lot about it. COVID was still kind of there, and so she was kind of on the fence. We had loosened up a little bit, but she ultimately decided just basically kind of adopt the same kind of approach. But since then, for example, I did not, for the last three. Ultimately, all three have not gone to trial except for one who is a stipulated evidence trial, not a jury trial. I had decided we're not live streaming. And it was interesting because Before, the defendants wanted, or Mr. Chauvin wanted cameras in the courtroom, and the other defendants did too, and the state did not. Then it flipped, and they said, that worked. The state wanted it. The defendants said, no, we don't. So they were shifting in their positions. But my criteria was basically, do I need to live stream contrary to the rule to preserve constitutional right to a public trial and First Amendment right of public access to a trial? And so I said, in this unique situation, the answer is I got a live stream.
Okay, we got a few more questions and about 5 minutes left here. I'll come back to the back here next.
Thanks. Thanks again for the support that you offered to the employees. In St. Louis County, that was kind of the eye-opening experience for everyone. So a lot of that wasn't always available. But were there, first of all, is there copies of your plans available? Or could we get a copy of those potentially, of even the outline of what
Yeah.
you went through?
Yeah, we could give you an outline.
Okay,
for sure.
that would be great.
Yeah.
And then, was there any additional employee confidentiality forms that you required or waivers of?
There was not.
Okay.
No. Again, it was really that planning team knew their role, knew that this was of the utmost confidentiality, and I mean, they really stuck with it as far as we're aware. Yep.
And one in the back.
So I have two questions. One, how many jurors did you end up summons in for the trial? And then my other question is about how much was the cost to the court for a trial this size?
Do you want to take the jury question?
Yeah, because I think you know the money. We summoned about over 600 jurors just as a pool for this. We got about 350 who actually responded to the summons and then returned special questionnaires, because we told them up front, you are a potential juror in the murder trials that involved the death of George Floyd. People knew right up front. And the first page was, tell us what you know. Out of that, we got, like I say, about 340, 350. We had to go through 139 jurors to get our 14 people. That included responses to the questionnaire where both sides agreed this person could just be excused for cause. Just let him go now. We're not going to even talk to him. But they were considered, but 139, and I can't even remember how many we actually talked to on a sequestered basis. So they were one by one in the witness stand. And obviously that was broadcast, which oddly enough, just a little trivia here, Court TV said people were calling in wondering if we could make jury selection last longer. They loved the jury selection process. I'm like, man, my least favorite part of the trial, but it's like the unending cocktail party. But that, yeah, 139 is how many we actually had to talk to or go through.
Relative to the cost, all of our partners provided their services in kind, so we were not billed for, sheriff's office, nothing like that. The outright costs that we were able to track were fairly minimal, surprisingly. Some cost for the demo of the jury box and the gallery seating, and then the cost to move and install that digital evidence presentation technology into this courtroom, and some other minor costs, like I mentioned the table skirts. We already had the plexi, but by and large, because it wasn't our building, those costs were not, those were not borne by the district. They really resided with Hennepin County.
We have one last question.
Given everything that you guys learned as a result of this experience, is there anything that you would do differently, or would you, given another opportunity, so to speak, do everything that you did the same way?
Well, as luck would have it, we got another opportunity 7 months later. 7 months later, we had the trial of former Officer Kim Potter, and by and large, it was so much easier because we had this under our belt. The only difference is the main difference was the county board did not want to close the building again. So the building was open, other court operations were happening as they are every single day. And so that, again, has some pluses and minuses to closing the building and keeping it open. But by and large, we feel pretty good that we had enough time, we figured things out. The few things that we didn't anticipate, we fixed on the fly. And by the time that second trial came around, I think we all felt like we had the blueprint for this, which again was only due to the teamwork and collaboration of so very many people, of our partners and our staff, and flexibility. So as of now, we feel good about our blueprint. I don't think we would do anything differently than what we have queued up should this need arise again.
Tell your judges not to issue a gag order. Gag orders don't work. I tried it, didn't work. And that's true, I think, mostly because social media nowadays. I may tell the lawyers, don't talk about the case as much as possible, but the problem is there's always some source who's willing to feed it to somebody else, and it blows up on social media. So there are ways through anonymous sources, or maybe even they are the lawyers who are acting anonymously, that they can keep their identity secret and still say what they want to say. So gag orders don't work. Might as well keep it out in the front in the public and do everything on the record.
And I think if I can just say one more thing related to that, I think what we really learned as far as the live streaming, the value, was the transparency it brought and our ability as a district to show the public how court really is. It's not like you see in 60 Minutes on TV. And so it allowed them to see really through what the court system is, but also it shut down those rumors about, if only 6 people had been allowed in the courtroom, there could be a lot of rumors about, well, this witness said this or that. And it's like, there was no rumor control needed about what the witnesses said because everybody could watch it. And so in that way, live streaming was really wonderful as far as getting the justice system out there and for people to really understand what it's like.
All right. Thank you, Judge, and thank you, Stacy. Sure. Quick reminder, make sure you rate the session. There's a place to rate the session as well as the speakers just below. So please do that. And thank you guys again. We appreciate you.
You bet.